Good day. My name is Steve Yates, and I welcome you to this organisational pandemic planning webcast. My personal thanks go to Fortress Availability Services, who are hosting this event and continue to provide advice and support to organisations during this difficult period. To set the scene, organisations are currently witnessing a dynamic and changing global event. There's only impacting on their employees as cases of coronavirus, COVID-19 spread across all habitable continents, but also the supply chain and global stock markets. The World Health Organization now declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, now spreading globally across countries, cities, communities, and families. In the media, we've already seen headlines such as "The point of no return," "Cough, stay home," "Virus can only now be delayed," "Many more families going to lose loved ones." This has already led large organisations to focus on their business continuity plans, reviewing their current state, preparedness and response. And yet for some, it could soon become a business disaster. So, okay, what is a business disaster? Well, it's been described in the United Kingdom Home Office publication, "How Resilient is Your Business to a Disaster?" as being any unwanted significant event that threatens personnel, buildings, and/or the operational effectiveness of an organisation, which requires special measures to be taken to restore the business back to normal. So what leads unwanted significant incidents? Well, at this moment of time, I'm sure the COVID-19 certainly falls into this category and will, if not already, be impacting on your organisation. And as far as special measures concerned, well, I tend to cover some of these for COVID-19 as well as a range of preparedness and response for your consideration during this webcast. To get things underway, I put forward the following headings to provide baseline scenarios for planning purposes. They are human error, natural causes, and intentional causes. So human error, natural causes, and intentional causes. And it seems to me that when we consider COVID-19, this meets each of the baseline scenarios. Examples being when employees acknowledge that such a situation exists, ignore advice and visit areas which could be a personal risk to them. The virus is in the open and can be transmitted between employees and others, and is able to travel with them to other locations and to people. Media reports cause employees and management to become personally affected when they read some of the news headlines, some of those I've already read. With all this in mind, it's clear that organisations plan accordingly and should have within their business continuity arrangements a pandemic strategy and plan, thereby providing outline guidelines and directions for those who have been given responsibility to manage related events. Examples being when schools and business premises close due to the risk of transmission to others, and children and non-infected employees having to remain at home. Employees who have children who are unable to attend school, or they are a carer for someone who's elderly with underlying health issues, and they need to take time off to look after them. Employees who have partners who have to self-isolate due to returning from an infected country, or have been infected with another person. The potential of or actual travel disruptions, restricting movements to key operational locations. Failure of supply chain resources and limitation on delivery of products and services. Impact on financial markets, causing movement of the organisation's stock price position. Lack of preparedness to provide sufficient assurance to employees of a safe working environment. Separation of some to contingency operations when you disperse them. And lack of a response to deliver contingency options as the situation worsens for continuation of business as unusual. and it will be business as unusual. So I plan to cover most of these in more detail later on. However, for those of you who find yourselves involved in managing pandemic planning, each of the scenarios and potential events need consideration against what if. It now requires all organisations to take into account the level of risk to their operational capabilities and ensure that they put in place sufficient preparation response measures for each of the following: loss of operating capacity, loss of capital or profits, loss of market share, loss of credibility and or brand, image and reputation, and finally, impact on regulatory compliance with legislation or codes of practice. For all these areas I've mentioned, the overriding needs to ensure a safe working environment for employees, whilst at the same time keeping a business as usual approach to day-to-day activities. The first issue is more pressing than the second. However, the second is crucial for the medium to long-term consequences of the organisation. With all this in mind, I thought that before starting my presentation, it would be best if I provide you a short bio about me. I initially served in the military during the Cold War, where my main role was to either get somewhere in Europe, dig a hole, and wait for a nuclear, chemical or biological war. So whilst I was there, it seemed the best option for me, mainly for my own personal protection, was to find out more about this subject matter. With this in mind, I became an instructor of what we now know as CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. The knowledge which continued to keep me and my family safe over many years. Moving on to some of the other areas I've been involved in, I originally wrote a paper on operational resilience when I worked for British Telecom. And it was looking at moving from disaster to continuity. And my role there was the head of resilience and recovery. Nothing to do with CBRN. And my early career started with several incidents which affected individuals, more so when there was a telephone exchange fire, and during the early 90s, several terrorist events in London. I guess really, I'd like to jump on to between 2008 and 2012, when I actually was given the role, I'm very happy about that one, as the head of business continuity and crisis management for the Olympic Delivery Authority. That was at the time during the London 2012 Olympic Games. And during that period, I had a lot of responsibilities for emergency planning and for pandemic planning itself. There were 2 pandemic events during my watch at the Olympics, and I chaired the pandemic working group, which I'll be concentrating more on as we progress. So a lot of different areas I've been involved in, and currently I work separately by myself and chair the Resilience Association as of this year. So the agenda I will be looking at are in several key areas here. We're going to look at the background, do a what if, consider the pandemic documentation, and finally some of the supporting elements. My main objectives are to enable anyone who's listening to this webinar to learn from previous pandemics, certainly the current situation on COVID-19, its current status. Look at some of the guidance from WHO and the UK Department of Health and Social Care, the development phases for a pandemic. Touch on infectious disease pandemic modelling, consider the worst case scenario, and then some baseline pandemic planning information. And specifically where it causes operational disruptions. And then to look at the pandemic working group plan and find some final thoughts at the very end of it all. So let's talk about some of the background here. A few weeks ago, Chinese hospitals were overflowing with COVID-19 patients, and yet now have empty beds, as the number of new cases reported each day has plummeted in the past weeks. In a report released on the 28th of February of this year, there are some startling observations made by a mission organized by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the Chinese government, where some 13 foreigners were allowed to join 12 Chinese scientists on a tour of 5 cities in China to study the state of COVID-19 epidemic and the effectiveness of the country's response. This report is unequivocal. It states China's bold approach to contain the rapid spread of this new respiratory pathogen has changed the course of a rapidly escalating and deadly epidemic. It then says this declining COVID-19 case across China is real. The question now is whether the world can take lessons from China's apparent ambitious, agile and aggressive successful approach, and whether the massive lockdowns and electronic surveillance measures imposed by the Chinese government would work in other countries, as it is believed that hundreds of thousands of people in China did not get COVID-19 because of this type of response. Findings from the report pose difficult questions for all countries, not least the United Kingdom, as it responds to COVID-19. More so as there is still uncertainty about what the virus would do, as the country in China, as the country continues to lift some of its strictest control measures and restarts its economy. This report came at a critical time in what many epidemiologists now consider a pandemic, as the number of affected countries continues to increase, and certain countries such as South Korea and Italy, as well as Iran, have discovered that they already have a community spread of the virus, as opposed to cases only in travellers from affected areas of people who are in direct contact with them. And hence the numbers of reported cases are growing exponentially. So my aim for this session is to provide delegates with background information on past pandemics and current COVID-19, as well as guidance information. The objectives are learning from previous pandemics, current situation on COVID-19 status, and the guidance from WHO and UK Department of Health and Social Care. As you will see from this slide, there are some quite interesting numbers, well, damning numbers, I suppose, from previous pandemics, and certainly from those more recently. But I would like to take note specifically of the Spanish flu and also the USA influenza figures that have recently come out between October of last year and February of this year. The first point to note about the pandemic, the flu pandemic in 1918, was the death toll, and it varies depending on which some of the documents you pick up, but the main thoughts are between 20 to 50 million people. And between 1918 and 1920, a disturbingly deadly outbreak of influenza tore across the globe, inflicting over a third of the world's population, infecting over a third of the world's population, ended the lives of 20 to 50 million people. Of the 500 million people infected in the 1918 pandemic, the mortality rate was estimated at 10 to 20%. We're up to 25 million deaths in the first 25 weeks alone. What separated the 1918 flu pandemic from other influenza outbreaks was the victims, where influenza had always previously only killed juveniles and the elderly or already weakened patients. It had begun striking down hardy and completely healthy young adults, while leaving children, those with weaker immune systems, still alive. Secondly, I just would like to look at some of the numbers that have come out from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. In the influenza outbreak in US during between October and February 2020, the death toll was 20,000 to 52,000 individuals. And, you know, over this period, it's estimated 34 to 49 people were sickened with the flu, with some 350,000 to 620,000 hospitalized. Although this data does not capture all the cases of flu that occur in the US, it does provide an estimated range to better reflect the larger burden of influenza. These estimates are calculated based on CDC's, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, weekly influenza surveillance data, and at this stage are considered preliminary. The current situation from COVID-19 is basically we've entered uncharted territory in the global battle against this deadly coronavirus. And as new infections have dropped dramatically in China, but surged in affected countries, the death toll continues to rise in South Korea, Iran, Italy, as well as other countries in Europe and elsewhere. Globally, this virus has so far infected 134,500, with the number of cases outside of China rising 13-fold in the past 2 weeks. It's affected 118 countries, leading to 4,900 deaths, based upon current data available as of the 13th of March 2020. The UK government scientific advisors expect that COVID-19 will peak within 10 to 14 weeks. 10 to 14 weeks. However, recently, Dr. Marcus Espinal from the Pan American Health Organization commented, the pandemic issue has pros and cons because the world pandemic can also create fear, stigma, can also suggest that the international community cannot contain this virus. He said, calling into question a very fine line. Therefore, why is COVID-19 such a threat? Firstly, it can kill healthy adults, such as clinicians, in addition to elderly people with existing health problems. The data so far suggests that the virus has a case fatality risk of between 1 to 4%. That will make it several times more severe than the typical seasonal influenza. Certainly, COVID-19 is transmitted quite efficiently. The average infected person spreads the disease to 2 or 3 or more, and super spreaders especially, to others. That's a rate of increase. There is also strong evidence that it can be transmitted by people who are just mildly ill or not even showing symptoms yet. This means that COVID-19 will be much harder to contain than Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, or the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, SARS, which were only spread by those showing symptoms and were much less efficiently transmitted. In fact, COVID-19 has already caused 10 times many cases as SARS in just a quarter of the time. And with the current spread of COVID-19, WHO has now officially defined this as being a global pandemic due to worldwide spread of this new disease. The good news is that national, local governments, bodies and public health agencies continue to take steps to contain and delay the spread and impact of this virus, whilst work continues on accelerating treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. However, alongside this, there are also physical, social and economic challenges that will test the resilience of any country or city. And as cities have increased their size and population, they become the epicenter of ever-accelerating mode of life. And as such, individuals review any restrictive practice as an attack on their human rights, as opposed to saving their lives. Something which has been apparent in Italy, as a population of some 60 million find themselves in extraordinary set of measures that's put the whole country in lockdown. And the Prime Minister himself made a reference to tricky aspects of some of his countrymen. This in turn will bring pressure on critical services, energy, water, transport and communications. And in order to protect and preserve these against a wide range of failures that could weaken a country's fabric, there is a need for each country city to respond accordingly to impacts on their population and communities. There is also a need for organisations to consider the possibility of critical services failing, either through stresses or capacity issues. Consider their risks and impacts and establish contingency strategies to manage operations. With all this in mind, organisations plan accordingly and ensure that the necessary resources are made available to manage organisational requirements and basically be in a position to deliver business as usual. Guidance from WHO has been quite extensive over the period of time since it was identified on the 31st December 2019. On the 30th of January, WHO declared the outbreak of COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. And on the 11th of March 2020, WHO made a decision to formally declare a global pandemic. The main takeaways from their preparedness documentation is, obviously, we see this a lot: wash your hands frequently, regularly and thoroughly clean your hands, maintain social distancing, maintain at least a meter, 3 feet distance between yourself, anyone who's coughing or sneezing. Avoid touching eyes, nose and mouth. Why? Because hands touch many surfaces, can pick up viruses. Once contaminated, hands can transfer the virus to your eyes, nose or mouth. From there, the virus can enter your body and can make you sick. Practice respiratory hygiene. Make sure you and the people around you follow good hygiene measures. That means covering your mouth and nose with your bent elbow or tissue when you cough or sneeze. Then dispose of the used tissue immediately. Self-identify if you have fever, cough and difficulty breathing. Seek medical care early. So stay home if you feel unwell. If you have a fever, cough and difficulty breathing, seek medical attention and call in advance. Follow the directions of your local health authority. And stay informed and follow advice given to you by your healthcare provider. These are the types of messages that are coming out globally now from different healthcare providers around the world, and they are well founded, I can tell you. The guidance from the UK Department of Health and Social Care over here initially identified over 80% of the population could be infected with COVID-19. But that is over the period of time the virus is moving. In general, the UK government says up to a fifth, 20% of the workforce could be off sick at the peak of an epidemic. So 20% is the main number we're working towards. Police may need to focus on only the most serious crimes and maintaining public order if virus spreads. Quite key, depending on what type of industry you're in and the threats that your operations are under. The military could provide support to emergency services if needed. They're on standby, ready to be called in. And the government's response in its first stage contained the outbreak with a number of UK cases that are still rising. So there's some other takeaways from there, and I'll explain this a bit further as we move on to the next slide. Among the measures which could be introduced if there are major infectious outbreaks are school closures. It's already happened in other countries. Italy, has shown what requirements are needed in Europe. But it also hopes to pass new laws to allow bigger class sizes. Restrictions on the use of public transport could happen. The stopping of big gatherings, that's already happening in all countries as events develop. Troops supporting emergency services, focusing on crime, disorder, legal powers to ensure that people stay in quarantine, and public information campaign launched to help people protect themselves. and the main focus again being on regular and thorough hand washing. Some of the other issues that we're currently seeing at this time. In the US, on Friday, 6th of March 2020, officials said the first 3 cases of flu-like system disease had been diagnosed in Montgomery County, Maryland, home to thousands of federal workers who travel into offices in nearby Washington daily. Agencies including the Commodity Futures Trading Exchange, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the banking regulators also have offices in New York, San Francisco, and New Jersey, where other cases have been reported. As New York banks start triggering their contingency plans, their watchdogs have also begun to take precautions, allowing more home working, cancelling and limiting travel, calling off conferences, and restricting some external meetings. The derivatives watchdog has cancelled some foreign travel and is allowing essential overseas trips on case-by-case basis. Likewise, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation said it had taken steps to limit non-essential international travel. Reuters also reported on Friday US Federal Reserves had taken the unusual step of quarantining US dollars it receives from Asia for up to 10 days. A spokesman for the Security Exchange Commission said the agency was following government advice that staff stay home when they are sick or when they have returned from coronavirus hotspots. In the UK, City of London firms have braced themselves for impact. Banks, insurers, law firms, and accountancy giants have opened their contingency plans, instituted travel bans, and cancelled events to try and mitigate the effects of the coronavirus outbreak. HSBC evacuated the floor housing its research department in Canary Wharf after an analyst was diagnosed with coronavirus. And Big Four accountancy firm Deloitte said on Tuesday that one of its City of London staff contracted the COVID-19 virus in Asia. It became one of the confirmed UK cases. The firm closed the door of its One New Street Square site overnight for a deep clean, but it opted not to close its City of London office. And just a few more points. Goldman Sachs sent staff from its security division to test its trading setup in Croydon in recent days. And JP Morgan established a virus recovery site in Basingstoke and has cancelled some meetings as a precaution. So all this means, if you're not already doing something, that you should be. Being prepared for significant disruption, directing your employees, stakeholders, and vendors on how to best plan for business is unusual. Something which I'm going to say more on shortly. So what if? Experts are worried about how much further COVID-19 could spread and how many people would get sick in the knowledge that WHO has declared a pandemic. So what if? What will the repercussions be worldwide, and how will it change the way we live, work, socialise and travel in each country? Would it mean cancelling all air travel and more quarantine of entire nations, similar to what happened in China? So the aim of this session is to provide delegates with supporting information that will enable them to consider what if. Be better acquainted with development phases for a pandemic, consider elements of infectious disease pandemic modelling, and understand worst case scenario for operational considerations. I just put up here the main phases that WHO set out for pandemic, and reached phase 6. With a global pandemic underway, we now need to consider a whole range of issues, not least the post-pandemic situation. Just remember the time span for phases 1 through 6 took several months. And, you know, based upon some of the data coming out now, this is moving, or will be moving, reasonably fast for each country, hopefully. In other words, we need to see an end. From a UK point of view, the UK has moved from contain to delay now. But reality is saying we already have research underway, and mitigation continues to go on thanks to those great people in healthcare workers who are putting themselves at risk in, putting themselves at risk for the community at large. A lot of data is now being put together, which is giving us a better understanding of certainly COVID-19. We've certainly witnessed trends from globalization to travel, urbanization, climate change, all of which are fueling the increased incidence of virus outbreaks. We're also in an increasingly mobile global population, traveling more for both work and pleasure than ever before. We increased migration due to conflicts. In 2018, data showed there were 4.2 billion air transport passengers journeys compared to 310 million in 1970, with a number of airports growing in China increasing their capacity in other countries. Pandemic models are being used to initially track movement and contact of infected people through to planning for the growth of this infectious disease worldwide. The data has already been able to inform us of the incubation time frame before anyone realized they have COVID-19, plus the period required for incubation and time needed for individuals to self-isolate themselves. This information will be key in future planning, and the events that we're seeing from COVID-19 will go towards further providing the source of pandemics and hopefully influencing mitigation in future. More so in today's interconnected world, with the ease of global travel driving greater opportunities for exposure to infectious diseases, the risk of pandemic has never been higher. Today, the data being collected from COVID-19, even when it is no longer a threat to our society, will continue to be an influence on our lives in the future. It's therefore key that public and private sector organisations work together and plan for the worst. Remember, failure to prepare is preparing to fail. Looking at worst case scenario for operational considerations. Your organisation faces and manages challenges every day. Frustrating events like late running transport, supplier delays, computer crashes, accidents and fraud can cause nuisance or other forms of disruption. But what if something similar affects your organisation during a pandemic? The impacts of such an event could prevent you from conducting businesses and affect your brand image and reputation. I'd recommend you look at the YouTube link there to give you some more background data. So what if you don't have enough staff? Your technology fails. Transport is disrupted. Your supply chain is affected. Your workplace is restricted. You'll be better prepared to respond to these challenges if you've given each factor some early consideration and have plans in place. Some businesses already have comprehensive business continuity plans, and where this is the case, you should ensure that they are reviewed to factor in uses and gaps that you may experience during a pandemic, and that any contingency measures take into account the additional pressures surrounding your organisation. Pandemic planning should therefore follow existing good practice and establish a pandemic working group. I fully recommend that, so that its importance is understood at all levels within the organisation. Determine a strategy for dealing with disruptions that could be caused by a pandemic, so that your organisation can continue to deliver key products and services. And write a plan that's considered resources such as people, premises, technology suppliers and stakeholders. Ensure that it's sufficient to implement the strategy you've agreed. Any pandemic will have the potential to impact on your day-to-day business operations in a range of ways. It's therefore important you're fully prepared to manage the potential impacts. Some of the areas where your day-to-day operations could be affected by a pandemic I'd like to cover now, along with some tips on how to plan ahead. First one, with employees. As the pandemic develops, it's highly likely that employees may not be available for work and need to have notified the organisation due to them having to take time off work or being late due to a whole range of issues such as normal leave, unauthorised annual leave, sickness, self-isolation. And, life continues here. We'll have maternity, paternity leave, any special leaves due to being called up from the military, travel disruption causing lateness during a workday. So much will be going on, not least school closures. Some of these will happen any normal year. However, when combined with a pandemic, the challenges increase with numbers of employees who may not be available for work. The range of reasons for employees not being available for work may need the organisation to make changes to their existing HR policies, human resources policies. Not least whether wages will be affected, and therefore all employees should be fully briefed. When you look at home working, where you may make a decision to send staff to, organise where possible should encourage employees to work more flexible hours or from different locations during a pandemic. Examples could be displacement to other buildings, work from contingency sites or from home, or start work at different times. In developing your plan for a pandemic, you need to ensure that any increase in home working is supported by appropriate technology, as if they're directly working from home, and that internal systems and internet service providers will be engaged in the planning process, so that demands of any corporate system can be understood and managed. As the infection rate increases, it's possible that remote working may become slower in more rural areas, or in very severe cases may be dropouts. Basically, the corporate system dropping people off to allow others to gain access to it. You need to consider alternative means of communication, using video conferencing maybe, but certainly review the corporate network's capacity. Seek advice if you're encouraging home working on measures employees working from home can take to ensure they get the best possible service. When we consider travel, your organisation should stop travelling, if achievable, to other affected regions and countries. If you need to travel to these locations, there should, as a minimum, be creation of a travel action plan for each employee who's travelling. Information provided for employees, informing them of the risk and areas to avoid. Protective requirements, protective masks, and other that is relevant to the work being carried out. And finally, monitoring of movements and regular updates of the situation in that region, country, to those employees who are there. Freight and deliveries will also be impacted. So during a pandemic, the need for deliveries becomes even more important. More so as the need to limit contact between other persons, or when there are restrictions on movement between locations. It's therefore important to identify freight and delivery logistical requirements. Also, public services such as transport and waste collections may be disrupted due to employees being affected by COVID-19. It also affects organisations that transport freight, causing disruption to delivery activity and the organisation's supply chain. As a result, deliveries, collections and servicing activities may or most likely need to change. This includes any activity from delivery lorries and vans, courier bikes, or even postal services. To prepare for this, you may wish to think about your overall deliveries and servicing needs during the pandemic, as well as those of your suppliers, and plan accordingly. Understand your current delivery, collection, servicing activities, including restrictions on the time of that activity. There may be specific local restrictions on noise, etc. Talk to your suppliers to ensure they have their own pandemic plan and identify what options they could provide. Understand how the pandemic will affect your organisation and whether it is necessary to rent your own vehicles and or subscribe to specific contingency transport options. Consider what changes you can make to your organisational activities to ensure only essential deliveries need priority. Start planning based on information available now. Bearing in mind your plans will need to be flexible to accommodate more detailed information when it becomes available. And finally, prepare a delivery and servicing plan annex for your pandemic plan, which provides a framework for you to manage freight movements to and from individual premises. We shouldn't also forget the water services and energy. Water, sewage and energy companies should have worked hard to assess the requirements for their services and put in place measures to ensure they continue to meet guaranteed supply standards to their customers during the pandemic. All utility companies should prioritise repair emergency faults during the pandemic, but perhaps not non-essential work such as planned maintenance and new connections may be limited by employee safety, travel and restrictions. And certainly, don't forget about your safety and security. Mainly the security part. The principal way in which business can help to reduce safety and security risk is by focusing on minimising their own vulnerabilities. These could be addressed by ensuring robust personal safety measures and business continuity measures are in place. Plan ahead to ensure you have adequate security personnel in place and taking appropriate measures to draw up mitigation and contingency plans, as well as providing personal protective equipment for security employees. And again, being aware that businesses employing private security employees will need to provide adequate training in advance of the pandemic or during the pandemic, for example, in identifying and dealing with potential or infected visitors. And finally, insurance. During the pandemic, it will be necessary to work in a different way. Your usual working hours may change. The products and services you offer may be amended. Employees may be working at alternative premises. Stock may build up at your premises because of delivery difficulties. And you may find yourselves using your business interruption insurance or requesting government support. For the main areas, you should inform your insurers about such changes to ensure that your insurance policies continue to provide you with expected protection. There may also be a need to increase or amend sums insured, add locations where your property is kept, or advise of changes to police responses during a pandemic. Subject to insurance conditions, you may have to contact insurers, advise on the changes you're making during the pandemic. Review the business interruption sum used to ensure it's adequate. Share your strategy and plan for the pandemic with your business interruption insurers. This may help speed up agreement to mitigation costs after the event. If you are planning to encourage home working during the pandemic, then you should consider the health and safety of employees in their homes. Is any company equipment being taken home? If so, does it need to be insured? Information security, especially security of third-party details if manual records are being moved. And very finally, just certain areas such as accommodation, you may need to consider having near to your offices hotel accommodation for those what-if situations when people cannot be transported elsewhere. And don't forget that local authority services will be affected as well as yourselves. And now the main real area, I suppose, what does this pandemic documentation really take into account? Remember, it's got to be operationally effective. It's got to consider business as usual. It has to support safety and security. It needs to identify assumptions and known weaknesses. It needs to be inclusive preparedness options for employees, supportive of critical products and services, and response, and provide internal external communication procedures, whilst having a pandemic working group contact details and executive management team contact details as well. And that's as a start. So a main aim here is to provide you with an understanding of the key elements that should be considered in your documentation. To understand the baseline pandemic planning structure, explain the pandemic strategy for operational disruptions, and review the structure of pandemic working group plan. The baseline pandemic plan information, well, the following key activities are required, elements for defining pandemic planning information rules, processes, and disciplines. First of all, we do need to establish the actual PWD, the Pandemic Working Group itself. See it as a steering committee. How is it going to operate? How is it going to control activities on a day-to-day basis? And that's 24/7. You've got to look at the internal organisation of your supply chain and external stakeholder community. Take into account operational risk assessment and business impact analysis that you would probably have already done, but consider them against that what if. And consider, have they covered everything you need to cover? You need to identify the preparedness and response organisational requirements. What does it actually look like? Produce pandemic strategy and the actual documentations here for the pandemic working group plan. And ensure that your instant response mechanism is sufficiently robust enough to meet the demands being placed upon it, whilst delivering employee awareness. Just some examples here of the actual sign-off terms of reference for the pandemic working group, and also an agenda for keeping them together. Some organisations will create what we would call a battle rhythm, so it fits in with reports, information flows that will come into it. So at the time it meets, it has all the relevant information available to it. For internal stakeholders, well, this is your business. Now, how does your business operate? 100% we need human resources engaged in this type of response. We need to understand how many members of staff aren't reporting to work, how many are off sick, how we're keeping in contact with them, what are our responsibilities. But all departments, depending on the structure organisation, we need to be engaged in this process, and individuals from them be representative on the pandemic working group. The supply chain must not be forgotten. I use this example here because you really need to identify core and strategic suppliers. You need to review them and identify a whole range of different elements about them. But really, what would they do in a pandemic? What is their pandemic plan? And you need to understand what support options you could expect based upon their understanding of their pandemic response capabilities. More so if you have a whole range of emergency response capabilities which you're drawing from these suppliers, whether it be for products and services or for personnel. You need to know what risks you're playing with during that period of time. And from an external stakeholders point of view, I use the one that this was all the different elements for liaison during London 2012 Olympics. It can be quite extensive. You need to know who they are because there is information flows you need to provide them with, whether it's similar to you're providing your employees, if you have that close affinity with them. But for the stability of the organisation, it is crucial that you do engage with those stakeholders and know how you're going to connect with them or communicate with them. I sort of mentioned the risk assessment and business impact analysis that most organisations should have in place already. Just remember, you probably have a range of resource or supporting information which needs to be overhauled or reviewed, certainly for this situation we now find ourselves in. It formed the basis for all your contingency plans, I would hope, and those contingency plans can provide you with a whole range of options during this period of disruption we're going through. But you need to really identify what you can do during your preparedness and response. I use a series of general options. They mainly see these from a business continuity point of view, but we need to understand things such as our cleaning regime. You know, how does that work? It's all right to use dusters and move things around, but all you're doing is moving the virus around. You need to understand some of the areas we're in this particular virus, COVID-19, how long it stays on certain types of surfaces, what types of cleaning products you should be using, and what precautions for the employees or the third-party companies you're using should have before even starting this process. But there needs to be employee communications going out on a regular basis. You need to keep them updated wherever they are. It needs to be consistent and in line with your level of preparedness as an organization. Some organizations, and I mentioned this earlier on, are splitting their employees geographically. They're starting to use other sites that they have, whether they have other buildings or contingency sites, or people, as we're now going to say, working from home. So much will be happening, you know, with their work from work area recovery sites, which are third-party sites, if the agreement you have with that site allows you to do this, or their home office. And even with reciprocal agreements, they're not very well recommended as options, but you may find yourself having to dislocate yourself from an office and need to find similar type office accommodation to carry your business forward. And when you're in a manufacturing area, it's quite crucial to ensure the level of safety stock you have is available to at least give you time. And time is always the big issue here during this type of event. But from a response point of view, we need to ensure we have an instant notification process, not only to our employees, to our stakeholders, suppliers, and you know, how are we going to move forward? How are we going to respond to an event that may happen, that may cause us to have to evacuate from an office, move people elsewhere, or if there has been a particular case, the deep cleaning of those offices? How do we go about that process, and how quickly can it go ahead for? You know, how long will it take? We need to have escalation and reporting processes through to decision making. Who's going to make some of these decisions? And what do those procedures actually look like? And there's a general type diagram on here just to try and visualize how will this all come together and how we keep that communications going between all parties and what options can you utilize or not utilize based on the agreements you currently have. The pandemic strategy is the real what if piece, I think. You know, we're trying to look at a whole range of different areas, you know, from governments and federal, it may be federal type operations, depending where we are in the world, who are actually laying down a series of criteria and how they would go about the process. You need to understand that. But certainly you need to put those planning assumptions in place. You need to identify alternate working arrangements that you have available to you. And certainly considerations about travel to work. You need to be more flexible with your employees. You need to accept it's not business as usual anymore. Late start and early finishes is quite key. You know, some organizations will, you know, affect changes to their paying conditions for employees. We need to take this into account, fully understand our human resources requirements for our staff. More so when we start looking at absence and pay. Governments around the world, certain governments are offering options to business, and that needs to be a consideration as well. But how do you go through those processes? School closures, quite critical. You know, Some individuals do not have the luxury of having other options available to them. And so you have to accept, how would the organisation deal in the event of school closures with members of staff who need to be at home? There will be self-isolation as well for those who have been in contact or have contracted COVID-19. The insurance industry as well, as we look at number 9 there on insurance, we need to take that into account. How do we go about that process? What are our plans for moving forward? And there'll be a whole range of other things which may be more specific to your operations that need some form of consideration. But we do need to understand who's going to form our pandemic working group. Who are the people who are going to oversee this challenge and actually bring together the resources that are necessary? That includes the incident management piece. But what are the roles and responsibilities? How do we contact people? And hang on here, we always need to keep going back and reviewing and maintaining. Life changes, and so will these documents. And keep a history of it, so we understand we're all on the same page, we all have the same version. That is so critical in these days. There's a lot on this page for a pandemic working group. The plan, how it comes together. I've put in there the top tier areas, executive summary, overview of the pandemic influenza, the planning framework, the policy and rationale. But this is the driver from the strategy. This has got to give you the right level of process and procedures, the right level of documentation necessary to enable the organisation to keep track of where they are, to understand what their priorities are, to know what options they have, who they need to report to, how they need to bring people together, how they keep people safe. I only commend you to consider each of these different areas in your planning thoughts as to what the end game will look. And remember, the rationale of having this pandemic working group is for that group to have the initial knowledge, to be able to use that knowledge and be the direction for the operations that you have around you. If you don't set that up and have the ability for horizon scanning, and to create a situational awareness of what is going on, it would take some time to get the machine up and running. This pandemic working group should be formed very early. If it's not already there, a group needs to be established that is in control of information flows that are coming in, needs to have a structure together so it can respond as events develop. I only leave this with you for consideration. There's a lot within this. Some you may decide is unnecessary for your organisation. But I've tried to pull it in for for a structure that gives you a chance to consider things against your capabilities. But when we look at an incident management response, we need to consider when that pandemic actually hits, when the incident occurs, so a member of staff suddenly collapses whilst they were clutching their chest and everything else, having been coughing or something else, dry cough. What happens next? There needs to be a reporting mechanism. There needs to be a decision-making procedure. We need to have a quick way to analyze the situation. That may be not necessarily just invoking if the pandemic working group's already live, together for the organisation. They need to be notified and decision made through that pandemic working group, give direction to everybody else. But if your decision's seen that this individual has, it's not as bad as it seems. If decisions are made that we have other processes we've created, I can't think of them at the moment, but I think we need to take that into account. We need to establish indicators and triggers, keep touch with that, to monitor it, situation review, advice, initiation process that may lead us back to bring in that notifying the pandemic working group and bringing that into play. And that will have significant implications for the whole organisation, or may have. But whatever ever happens, it's so key that we keep employees aware. I would say that certainly the mental health of a lot of individuals has probably been heavily impacted by the current situation that they find themselves in. So we need to they need to understand the organisation's pandemic strategy. That needs to be made available to all members of staff. They need to understand relevant business continuity response options, because they may be the ones having to go and change the way they operate to do things. We need to understand requirements for personnel and office cleanliness. And that's down to the individuals as well, bringing food in and leaving cartons and everything. They need to be part of the solution. We need reporting of any internal infectious personnel, escalating concerns, because they would have concerns about things that are going on around them. They need to have someone they can talk to or pass information on to. And if they do need to respond, if directed to self-isolate at home, some of the information is moved between 7 and 14 days. It depends which country and where you are. We need to understand and keep in contact with these individuals and take the necessary actions. So, some final thoughts. All I want to do really here is some thoughts on some of the organisation supporting elements. The arrangements for preparedness response, yes, but the structure and component elements and specific supporting capabilities. So just a quick run through, because to make the pandemic working group plan operate, it just doesn't happen when by a whim. It needs to have some readiness capabilities in place. A pandemic operations centre should be set up in any organisation. You can use your boardroom if you have one, security office, plant manager's office, dedicated facility. You know, whatever it looks like, it needs to be there. And it's when the whole coronavirus started off back in the end of December last year, some organisation probably did set up a centre just to monitor events as they start to occur. If you haven't got one, please do, because we need to have this central thought centre, this information flow, this monitoring of information that's coming in, and collect it together. But it's always helpful to have other breakout space around it if you have that capability. And also, don't forget this horizon scanning. It's fundamental. To do that, you need some other capabilities. Ballrooms have some capabilities, but perhaps not the most. So for setting up this pandemic centre, in the event it becomes fully operational, but we can use it to hold regular meetings of the pandemic working group, we need to consider how that information flow is going to be drawn together. And I've just given some examples here of some of the key pieces I would want to have in support, as well as the actual group, the pandemic working group itself. Just remember, we need to look at this in total. And this could be just a normal daily meeting where they're assessing where the organisation is or where the pandemic is itself. But they need support individuals with them to collate that information together so that you can produce and agree information flows to employees or to other stakeholders. So just some ideas there for you to consider. Equipment, whole range of different pieces of equipment that's key, more so if you work across different time zones, but certainly from medical status board to give an indication, is it getting worse, is it getting better, numbers of staff available, not available for work, what's their position, how they're being contacted, who had that responsibility, have they contacted them, whole range of different things. And as it develops, depending again on the scale of your operations, you may need to separate people into different spaces so they can concentrate in response to particular events as they're occurring. Lots of different communication ideas here. It's down to you how complex your organization is and, you know, where you sit at this time in response to the pandemic, which is currently underway. But lots of different options in there. And again, depending on the difficulties for communications in your particular areas as well. So I've quickly gone through a lot, and I hope you're still there listening to this at this time. There's been a whole range of different areas I've touched, but more so in the documentation and specifically within the structurally, how that looks and what capabilities you need to have surround it. The original objectives which I laid down here were to try and give a touch on previous pandemics, the current situation on COVID-19, its status at this present time, some of the guidance elements that are out there, you know, from World Health Organization and the UK Department of Health and Social Care, how this development phases and things are moving faster at this time than ever before, the modeling issues through to worst case scenario, but considering it from your business perspective, and the elements of organizational preparedness. What's enough? Some baseline pandemic through to strategy, pandemic strategy you need to have for operational disruptions, but your main plan, how are you going to deal with it? How do you deliver those processes and procedures, and what capabilities do you need to have with you? So that's it. If you're still there, thanks very much for listening to me. Again, if you do have any questions, please contact me, put my email address up there, and I'll do my best to provide you any support information I have if you can't find it amongst the mass of information that's currently available. But at the same time, I'd finally like to thank Fortress Availability Services for hosting this webcast, and I just hope that you and your families are safe and secure as it develops in the future. Thank you very much.